Single dad saved twin 6-year-old girls left by stepmom. Unaware they'd become his everyday miracle. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. They were not supposed to be there. Not in that barn. Not on that night. Not on that stage, under the yellowed light bulb swaying in the breath of an Oregon mountain wind. But there they stood, two little girls in tattered dresses, feet bare, hands clenched, eyes too old for their years. And just beyond the rusted cattle gates, a man named Graham Walker held his breath and forgot, for a moment, how to move. He had come for scrap. That was all. A busted alternator and a coil of copper wire he hoped would fetch enough at the recycler to fill his truck with gas, and maybe buy his boy a new set of battery for the radio he used to fall asleep. He did not come for this. Ain't much left to say. The woman on stage snarled, dragging one of the girls forward by the wrist. Her breath fogged in the cold, and so did her words, thick with gin, worn with rage. They can clean. They can cook. They don't cry anymore. No one in the crowd, a dozen maybe, all shadows in work coats and frayed hats, said a word. Not at first. The taller girl, the one being shoved forward, did not flinch. Not when her shoulder was yanked. Not when the cigarette ash fell on her arm. She just stood there, chin lifted, jaw set like she'd decided long ago that pain would not win. The smaller one hid behind her, lip quivering, holding a piece of thread between her fingers like it was the last piece of comfort in the world. Starting at 200, the woman barked. For the pair. That ain't robbery. That's charity. And still, nothing. Graham's boots felt too tight. His chest is too heavy. And the voice of his son, Ben, echoed in his memory. Don't look away, Daddy. That's when people get hurt the most. When good folks look away. He didn't look away. He stepped forward. I got $78, he said. His voice cracked somewhere between disbelief and defiance. And 3 cents. Every eye in that barn turned to him. The woman on the stage narrowed her gaze. You making fun of me, Walker? No, ma'am. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the old leather wallet his wife had given him the year before she died, counted the bills, emptied the coins, laid them on the gate rail like an offering. It's what I got. If you want him to go somewhere safe, to sleep indoors, it's all I can give. The silence was sharp. Then, from the shadows near the back of the barn, a woman stepped forward. A stranger in a long gray coat. Her hat tilted low. Her voice smooth like riverstone. I'll cover the rest. Graham didn't turn to see her. He was too busy looking into the eyes of the taller girl, the way she held her sister, the way she dared the world to come closer. He knew that look. He'd seen it once in a mirror, after the funeral, where he told himself he had to keep going for Ben. And just like that, he opened the gate. Can you walk? He asked. The girl nodded. What's your name? She hesitated. Ellie, she whispered. She's Nora. He held out his hand. Come on, girls. Let's go home. They didn't ask what home meant. They didn't ask what came next. They just stepped off the stage and into the cold with nothing but hope wrapped in silence. The drive down a mountain was slow. Snow clung to the edges of the gravel road, and Graham's old pickup creaked like it was asking for forgiveness. In the front seat, Ben leaned against the window, sensing something had changed but unsure of what. His pale eyes followed shadows he couldn't see. The girl sat in the back wrapped in the 2 spare jackets Graham kept behind the seat, ones that smelled of pine shavings and motor oil. Nora fell asleep halfway through, her head on Ellie's shoulder. Ellie stayed awake, eyes open, watching everything. When they reached the cabin, just 2 rooms, a stove that needed coaxing, and a roof held together by stubbornness and prayer, Graham unlocked the door and stepped aside. You're safe here, he said. You don't owe me anything. They walked in like children too, afraid to believe. Ben followed them, pausing once to turn toward his father. He reached out and tapped the wall beside the door. Once, then twice. Yes. No. Ellie looked up. He's talking, she said quietly. Graham nodded. That's how we talk when it gets too quiet. She nodded back. And for the first time, a flicker of something like trust passed between them. That night, Graham slept in the recliner. The girls took the pull-out couch, still clinging to one another. Ben, as always, fell asleep to the sound of static on his radio, holding it like it might carry his mother's voice back through the wires. Graham stared at the ceiling, hands folded over his chest, heart heavy with 100 questions and no clear answers. What have I done? What happens now? But beneath the fear, something else took root. The kind of quiet that doesn't scream. The kind that whispers. Maybe this is how it begins. Not with fanfare, but with a choice. With $78.03 and a porch light someone decided to leave on. That was how the story started. Not with blood, but with belonging. Not with a rescue, but with a decision. And in that old barn, under the hum of a single dying bulb, 3 lives collided with one man who just couldn't look away. And somewhere behind them, a woman in a gray coat disappeared into the night, leaving behind more than money. She left behind a spark. And in time, that spark would become a fire. A fire warm enough to build a family around. A fire bright enough to carry them home. The road home was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the faint rattle of Graham's old pickup as it rolled over potholes and patches of frost-hardened gravel. The wind outside had lost its sharp edge, replaced by a hush that blanketed the woods in winter stillness. Ellie sat in the back seat, her small frame hunched protectively around her sister. Nora had fallen asleep halfway through the drive, her head resting on Ellie's lap, thumb tucked beneath her chin. Graham stole a glance in the rearview mirror. The girls looked too small back there, too quiet, too knowing, like they'd already lived more life than most grown folks ever should. He wanted to say something, to offer reassurance or promise, but he'd learned long ago that the most sacred kind of welcome is the kind that doesn't require explanation. Ben sat in the front passenger seat, his pale eyes open, unseeing, head tilted slightly toward the sound of his father's breath. He hadn't spoken since they left the barn. Graham didn't expect him to. Ben processed the world slowly, through vibrations and silences and the soft geometry of trust. He simply reached out and touched his father's forearm as they pulled into the clearing. The cabin emerged from the woods like a memory. 2 rooms of old timber and patched shingles, smoke curling from a crooked chimney, the porch light casting a faint amber glow against the snow. It wasn't much, but it was home. Graham cut the engine and stepped out. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the passenger side and helped Ben down, steadying the boy as he stretched stiff legs. "You stay close," Graham said gently, tapping twice on Ben's shoulder, their signal for caution. Then he turned to the back. Ellie was already halfway out, balancing Nora's weight against her side. "You don't have to carry her," Graham offered. Ellie didn't respond. She merely shifted her grip and adjusted Nora's head against her shoulder. He opened the door to the cabin and let the warmth spill out, faint but real, thanks to the stove that still held a coal bed from the morning. He set down the extra jackets he'd packed and motioned toward the couch. "You can rest here tonight," he said softly. "Blankets are clean. I'll fix something warm." Ellie didn't speak, but she lowered Nora gently onto the pull-out couch, pulled off their worn shoes, and sat beside her sister like a sentry. Ben, meanwhile, had made his way to his usual spot by the fireplace, kneeling down to feel the heat with his hands. Graham moved to the kitchen, heating water in the dented kettle, pouring it over the last of the peppermint tea bags. He added honey, just a spoonful, and placed the mugs on the table. "I don't know how you take it," he said to no one in particular, "but it's warm." Ellie eyed the mugs warily. Then, slowly, she stood and walked over, lifting one with both hands. She didn't sip at first, just held it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Do you have a name?" Graham asked gently. She hesitated. Then, almost imperceptibly, "Ellie." He nodded. "That's a strong name. I'm Graham. This is Ben." Ben turned slightly, offering a half-wave that didn't quite reach its destination. Ellie looked at him for a long moment. "Is he blind?" Graham finished. "Since birth. But he sees in other ways." She looked back at her sister, then at Graham. "She's Nora." He smiled. "Thank you." That night, as the fire crackled low and snow whispered against the window glass, Graham laid an extra quilt over the girls and turned out the light. Ben, already in bed, whispered, "They're scared." "I know," Graham replied. "They don't cry out loud." Graham's chest tightened. "That's the worst kind." The next morning came slow, the kind of gray that made time feel suspended. Graham woke early and set the coffee to boil. He didn't want to wake the girls too soon. Let them sleep. Let them rest in a world that asked nothing from them, at least for a while. When Ellie emerged, she moved like someone testing the floorboards for traps. Her eyes darted to the door, to the stove, to Ben, then back to her sister still curled on the couch. Graham handed her a plate of eggs and toast. "No catch," he said. She blinked. "We don't clean for food." He shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing." Ellie sat down slowly. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the toast. Graham turned to Ben. "You feel like a story today?" Ben nodded. "The one about the snow fox." Graham began, his voice low and calm. As he spoke, Ellie leaned in slightly. She didn't mean to, but something in the rhythm of his voice, the way Ben smiled at certain parts, it pulled her in. By the end of the story, Nora was stirring. She sat up blinking. Her hair was a mess of curls, her cheek red from the pillow seam. She looked at Ellie first, then at Graham. "Are we still here?" she asked. "Yep," Graham said. "And no one's moving you." She nodded slowly and reached for Ellie's hand. The touch was automatic. Centuries old, it seemed, built from pain and promise. Over the next few days, the cabin began to breathe differently. Not louder, just deeper. Ellie swept the floor without being asked. Nora helped Ben stack wood. Graham taught them how to make pancakes from scratch, how to tell if snow was too heavy for the roof, how to listen to the wind. No one asked about the barn. No one asked about before, because the cabin didn't require confessions, only presence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ben reached out and touched Ellie's arm. He tapped once, then twice, then once again. Ellie stilled. "You're asking if I'm okay?" Ben smiled faintly. Ellie looked at Graham. "We used to do that, too. Tap signals. When we weren't allowed to talk." Graham didn't speak. He simply nodded and placed another log on the fire. That night, as he lay awake listening to the soft breathing of 3 children in 3 different corners of the house, he realized something had shifted. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of stories waiting to be told. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to hear them. The third morning at the cabin began with the sound of rain tapping gently against the tin roof, a soft, rhythmic whisper that seemed to hush the world outside. Graham Walker stood in the small kitchen, the sleeves of his flannel rolled up, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the old gas stove. The scent of cinnamon and brown sugar mixed with the earthy dampness that crept in through the floorboards. He moved with care, as if afraid that even the smallest misstep might shatter the fragile stillness that had settled over the house since Ellie and Nora arrived. He glanced toward the living room. Ellie sat curled up in the far corner of the old pull-out couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her gaze was distant, but not hostile. Not anymore. She no longer flinched when Graham entered the room. That to him was progress. Nora, on the other hand, had taken to trailing behind her older sister like a shadow. She hadn't said a single word since that night at the barn. Not one, but she watched closely. Her big brown eyes followed every movement, every sound, as if trying to memorize what safe looked like in case it disappeared again. And then there was Ben, 9 years old, blind since birth, yet never missing a thing. He sat cross-legged on the braided rug, his small hands running over the pages of a worn Braille storybook. He didn't ask questions about the girls. He didn't need to. He felt them, in the way the cabin no longer echoed quite the same, in the breathy hush of Nora's presence, in the faint scrape of Ellie's boots by the door. "Breakfast," Graham said gently, setting the bowls down on the scarred wooden table. He didn't call them by name yet, not because he didn't care, but because he understood what it meant to let someone come to the table on their own terms. Ben moved first, his fingers grazing the edge of the table until he found his seat. Then, slowly, Ellie slid off the couch and approached, not looking up but not hiding either. Nora followed. They took the seats Graham had laid out, for mismatched chairs, each warmed by the fire's quiet hum. Nobody spoke, but they ate. And sometimes in places where silence used to mean fear, the act of eating together is its own kind of trust. That afternoon, Graham handed Ellie a dish towel. "If you dry, I'll wash." She hesitated. You don't have to, he added quickly. Just thought maybe you'd like something to do. Helps the hands settle sometimes. She took the towel. They worked in quiet rhythm. Graham washed carefully, setting the warm plates on the drying rack. Ellie wiped them down with small, deliberate movements. Across the room, Nora sat near Ben, who was explaining something about the storybook in his lap. This one's about a fox that gets stuck in the snow, he said, his fingers moving over the bumps. But he finds his way back by following his heartbeat. Nora didn't answer, but she reached out, tentatively, and touched the edge of the book. Ben smiled. That night, Graham stoked the fire and handed out extra blankets. The temperature was dropping, and the wind had picked up, howling like an old ghost down from the mountains. He didn't ask if they were cold. He just made sure. They were warm. When Ellie laid her head down beside Nora on the pull-out bed, she whispered, "It smells like sawdust." Nora blinked at her. "The blanket," Ellie added. "But it's clean." That was all she said. But Nora tucked her fingers into Ellie's hand and closed her eyes. Somewhere deep in the cabin, Ben stirred and turned toward the wall. The air was still, safe. The days that followed came like slow waves, gentle, unhurried, each one smoothing a little more of the jagged edges the children carried with them. Graham kept routines. Oatmeal in the morning, chores after lunch, stories by the fire at dusk. He never raised his voice, never pried. He understood what it meant to be broken and still breathing. He taught Ellie how to split kindling. Not with force, he said, guiding her hands. With intention. She nodded, absorbing more than his words. Her arms were thin but strong, not from health, but from having to survive. She didn't speak much, but she started asking for things. "Where's the matches?" Or "Can I help with that?" It was her way of saying, "I'm here now. I'm trying." Nora began humming, just under her breath. Old nursery songs. Fragments, really. But it was music. And in a house that had once gone too quiet for too long, it was everything. Ben, for his part, blossomed. He learned to identify Ellie by the sound of her step, and Nora by the way she touched his shoulder to say hello. He shared his books. He let them braid his hair. Once, he even laughed out loud when Nora tried to teach him how to whistle and failed spectacularly. Graham watched it all with a quiet awe. He wasn't fixing them. He knew that. He was just holding the space steady while they learned how to be children again. One morning, a cold front blew in early. The sky turned a pale, untrusting gray, the kind that made animals hunker down and trees sway nervously. Ellie was helping stack firewood when she suddenly dropped the logs and backed away, her hands shaking. Graham stepped forward slowly. "What is it?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something that wasn't there. Graham followed her gaze. Nothing, just the woods, still and tall. "Hey," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "You're safe. You're not back there. You're here, with us." She blinked fast. Her breath hitched. "Can you count to 5 for me?" She nodded. Started. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Graham placed a hand on the log pile. "Good. Let's keep going, yeah?" She wiped her nose with her sleeve and picked up another log. Later, she didn't say thank you, but she added one more piece of wood to the stack than she had the day before. He noticed. That night, as rain returned, tapping steady against the roof, Graham brought out a deck of cards. He taught the kids how to play a simple game, war. Nora laughed when she beat Ben 3 times in a row. Ben pretended to be scandalized. Ellie didn't play. She sat beside the fire, knees drawn up, watching. But she didn't look away when Graham caught her eye. She just tilted her head, curious, present. And when he said, "Maybe tomorrow you can teach us a game," she didn't say no. The trust didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It came in crumbs. The way Ellie asked for seconds at dinner, the way Nora stopped clutching her sister in the night, the way Ben leaned into Ellie's quiet strength. And in return, Graham felt something thaw in himself. A warmth he hadn't let in since his wife passed. Not hope, not yet, but the space where hope could live. On the 6th night, as the fire crackled low and the wind outside softened to a lullaby, Graham stood at the window. Behind him, 3 children slept, not peacefully, not entirely, but without fear clawing at their dreams. He touched the window pane. Cold. Solid. Behind him, the cabin was warm. Safe. Alive. And for the first time in a long time, Graham didn't feel like the last man standing. He felt like a father again. The February wind settled across the Oregon woods like a blanket of breath held too long. Snow still clung to the northern slopes, but the sun was beginning to win small battles on the south-facing rocks. Graham Walker stood outside the cabin with a dented tin bucket in one hand and a list of things he couldn't fix in the other. Roof leaks, low propane, a truck that coughed more than it ran. But none of that compared to the quiet unfolding inside. Ellie had taken to the corner by the wood stove, where she now spent most afternoons flipping through an old medical encyclopedia Graham had found at a yard sale years ago. The pages were yellowed, dog-eared, and smelled faintly of mildew, but she treated them like treasure. When she turned a page, it was with the care of someone handling sacred glass. Graham watched her sometimes without her knowing. The way she traced diagrams with her finger, mouthing long words she didn't fully understand but somehow remembered. He didn't ask how she knew to wrap Ben's wrist in just the right way when he fell on the ice, or how she could look at a cut and instinctively know whether it needed stitches. Some things kids learn because they want to, others because they have to. That afternoon, when Ben scraped his knee chasing the neighbor's dog down the trail, it was Ellie who moved first. Graham had barely stood when she was already at Ben's side, whispering gently, tearing a strip from the hem of her sleeve to press against the wound. Her movements were steady, practiced. Ben winced, then relaxed. "You always carry fabric in your pocket?" Graham asked, only half joking. Ellie looked up at him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "You never know when someone will need fixing." He didn't laugh. He just nodded. "That's true." Nora, on the other hand, had a voice that didn't wait to be invited. It started small. A protest over a broken crayon Ben couldn't find. A correction when someone mispronounced Ellie's name at the diner they visited once a week for groceries and a grilled cheese sandwich. But by March, it became something more. Graham received a phone call from Mrs. Hewitt, the principal of the elementary school 10 miles down the mountain. "Mr. Walker," she began, hesitant, "I wanted to speak to you about Nora." He stiffened. "Is she in trouble?" "No, sir." The woman chuckled softly. "Quite the opposite. She stood up today. Literally. In the middle of the lunchroom, after one of our fourth-grade boys mocked another student with a stutter." Graham closed his eyes. "What did she do?" She stood on her bench and said, "If your words can hurt, they're too small for your mouth." Then she offered the other boy half her sandwich and told the table they could listen or leave. He blinked. She said that, word for word, and they listened. That night, Graham sat beside Nora on the front step, watching the last of the snow melt into the gravel. She kicked her legs slowly, scuffed boots, barely brushing the ground. "You mad?" she asked without looking at him. "No, I said it nicely." "I know." She turned to him then, eyes wide and unsure. "You still gonna let me stay here?" He swallowed hard. "I was never letting you. You just belong." Nora leaned against his side, and for once, didn't say anything else. One evening, Ellie found a squirrel with a limp near the woodshed. Most kids would have panicked or screamed. Ellie followed it for 20 minutes until it gave up and sat under the woodpile, heaving from fear and cold. She didn't touch it. Not at first. She just sat near, talking softly, offering bits of apple from her pocket. Graham watched from the window. She didn't move quickly or try to catch it. She waited. When the squirrel finally edged closer, Ellie wrapped it in a towel and carried it into the shed like a nurse moving a fragile patient. "It's probably scared," she told Graham. "So was I," he replied. She blinked, then smiled. They named it Clover. By April, Nora had taken over the church bulletin board in town. Not officially, but she brought in handmade posters every Sunday morning. One read, "Speak kindly, even when you're tired. Someone's heart might be listening." Another had a drawing of a girl holding a cracked bowl with the words, "We are all still holding things together. Don't knock them over." The pastor left them up. Graham caught him once, staring at one of the posters longer than necessary. He said nothing, just nodded at Graham and walked away. The children grew in different ways, as all children do. But there was something about Ellie and Nora that felt older, not in age, but in knowing. One evening, when a storm knocked out the power again, they sat by candlelight in the living room. Ben played with a wooden puzzle on the rug, listening to the wind through the cracked window panes. Graham passed around mugs of warm milk with honey. Ellie wrapped her hands around hers like it was the last warm thing on earth. "Do you think people are born to fix things?" she asked. "What kind of things?" Graham replied. "Hearts, bodies, each other." He looked at her over the candle flame. "I think people are born to notice. Fixing comes after." Nora piped up. "Then what am I for? Talking until someone listens." "Sometimes," he said, "that's the only way anything changes." She grinned. "Good. Because I'm really good at that." They laughed, but Graham's eyes lingered on them a little longer than usual, on the soft lines of hope beginning to return to faces that had known too much fear. On the way, Ellie sat a little taller now. On the way, Nora no longer whispered her truth. They weren't healed. Not yet, but they were healing. When spring finally touched the woods in late April, the cabin felt different. Not bigger, not newer, but brighter. The kids painted rocks and lined them along the trail. Ellie made tiny labels for wildflowers using popsicle sticks and a red marker. Ben asked for a cane, not because he needed it, but because he wanted to go further with them when they wandered. Graham carved. One from pine, sanded smooth, initials carved along the base. And every evening, Ellie and Nora each found their own kind of peace. Ellie with her books and diagrams. Nora with her questions and her fire. Sometimes healing doesn't happen in hospitals or through speeches. Sometimes it begins with a girl wrapping a squirrel in a towel, or another girl standing up in a lunchroom to say, "This isn't right." And sometimes, just sometimes, a man who once believed he had nothing left finds himself sitting in the middle of a living room lit by candlelight, holding a mug of milk, surrounded by voices that don't just fill the silence. They replace it with belonging. That night, after the candles were blown out and the children were asleep, Graham sat by the window, listening to the trees sway outside. He thought of Ellie and her careful hands, of Nora and her bold voice, of how they had been handed nothing but found ways to give. He looked up at the night sky, stars struggling to peek through the storm, and he whispered, "Thank you for bringing them here, for letting me witness who they're becoming. Because sometimes the strongest people are the smallest. And sometimes the people who change everything don't come charging in. They arrive barefoot, bruised, and quiet. And they bring with them the kind of strength this world needs most." The first package arrived on a Thursday. It was just passed on when Graham opened the front door to find a brown paper parcel resting beside the firewood stack. No delivery truck, no footsteps in the snow. Just a package, wrapped in plain string with a small white card tucked underneath. On it, in slanted handwriting, were two simple words. "Keep going." Inside was a knitted scarf, warm, well-made, the kind you couldn't buy at the local hardware store. Folded beneath it, a small tin of hot cocoa mix and a set of thick woolen socks, still smelling faintly of cedar. Graham blinked at the items, confused but touched. He looked out toward the woods, half expecting someone to step from the trees. But there was only stillness and the sound of Ben giggling inside, his fingers trailing along the edges of a cardboard box Nora had turned into a Braille rocket ship. He said nothing to the children that morning, just tucked the note in his back pocket and hung the scarf on a hook near the door. More parcels came over the following weeks. A box of canned soup, a bag of fresh apples, a children's medical encyclopedia with large illustrations, left on the porch during a snowstorm, each accompanied by a handwritten card, each signed the same way. "Keep going." Ellie was the first to ask, "Dad, who keeps leaving us these?" Graham hesitated. "Someone kind. Do we know them?" He shook his head slowly. "Not yet." That night, after the children were asleep, Graham sat by the fireplace, staring at the unopened can of peaches left that morning. The label was foreign, not from any store nearby, and the handwriting, familiar in a way that tugged at something buried. He turned the note over. On the back, written in the same hand, "You saved 3. Someone saved me." He stood. It was time to find out who she was. It took Graham a week of asking around. He visited the post office, the diner, the thrift store run by the retired nuns. No one had seen anything until he spoke to a man named Elijah who ran a quiet repair shop on the edge of town. "You looking for someone who sends care like that?" Elijah said, wiping grease from his hands. "There's a woman lives up by the old mill. Doesn't talk much. Keeps to herself. Name's Margot Lane." The name knocked something loose in Graham's memory. A face, younger then, eyes too old for the body they sat in. A girl from the group home across county lines. The one who never cried. Not even when it would have made sense. He found her 2 days later. A modest A-frame cabin hugged the edge of the woods, its chimney trailing smoke into the pale sky. Wind chimes hung from the porch, crafted from old silverware and bottle caps. Wind made them sing in gentle, uneven tones. She opened the door before he knocked. "You took your time," Margot said. Her hair was streaked with gray now, but the steel in her voice hadn't dulled. "I wasn't sure," Graham admitted, "that it was me, or that someone might care." He managed to smile. "Both." She stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of her home smelled like rosemary and old books. Dozens of tea mugs lined the shelves, each one mismatched and chipped. Graham noticed the quiet first. Not empty, intentional, like she'd filled the space only with what mattered. "I run a foundation now," she said, pouring hot water over 2 mugs. "Lantern light. Small, quiet. We help people who help others. No press. No website. Just lights in the dark." He looked at her. "Why us?" Margot didn't answer right away. She stirred honey into his tea. "Because you showed up with nothing but $78.03, she said finally. "And you didn't walk away. That matters to me." Graham sat back, the heat from the cup seeping into his hands. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "We noticed," she said. "The ones who were never picked. We notice everything." That night, Graham returned home with a mind fuller than he liked to admit. He tucked the newest package, a coat perfectly sized for Ellie, into the hall closet. When Ellie asked again about the gifts, he sat her and Nora down by the fire. "There's a woman," he said gently. "Her name is Margot. A long time ago, someone forgot her. Now she spent her life making sure no one else gets left behind." "Is she an angel?" Nora asked. Graham smiled. "No wings, but close." Ben reached out and touched Ellie's sleeve. She took his hand without hesitation. That night, the cabin didn't feel so small. Over the next month, the relationship grew. Margot never visited, but she called once, asking how Ben liked the Braille watch she'd left. Graham caught himself telling her about Ellie's love of anatomy, about Nora's way of turning every quiet moment into poetry. She listened, always quiet, never interrupting. He asked once, "Why don't you come by?" "Because it's not about me," she said. Graham understood. One morning, a large envelope arrived. Inside were school applications, scholarship forms, and a handwritten note. "When they're ready to fly, make sure they have somewhere to land." Ellie folded the note into a square and tucked it into her science journal. Nora pinned it above the coat rack. Ben, not knowing what it said, ran his fingers over the grooves and smiled. That winter, when a late storm knocked out power for 3 days, Margot sent a propane heater and a handwritten recipe for something called hope stew. It was mostly lentils, carrots, and salt, but they swore it tasted like something holy. On Christmas Eve, Graham opened the door to find a single lantern hanging from the porch beam. No note, no package, just light. He didn't need anything more. Some angels don't have wings. Some wear old scarves and leave cocoa tins on front steps. Some don't say much, but still remind us that what we do in quiet matters. That kindness leaves footprints, even in snow. That love, the kind that asks nothing but gives everything, doesn't need to be seen to be felt. And sometimes, that's the light we follow home. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the lace curtains, dust motes dancing like memory in the quiet air. Graham Walker stood by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal with one hand and cradling a worn mug of coffee in the other. Outside, the snow had mostly melted, revealing patches of wet earth and pine needles. It was late March, the kind of morning that whispered of spring but still carried winter's breath in the wind. In the corner of the kitchen, Ben sat cross-legged on the braided rug, his fingers running across the raised lines of his Braille storybook. Ellie and Nora, each wrapped in oversized sweaters that trailed past their wrists, were helping set the table. 5 places, 5 bowls, 5 mismatched spoons. That was the first miracle of the day, that none of them had to be reminded anymore. Graham had sent the final paperwork in 2 weeks ago. The social worker, a gentle woman named Diane who always wore sunflower pins on her lapel, had promised to call once the court finalized the guardianship. He tried not to think about it too much. Try not to hold his breath every time the phone rang. But that morning, the landline buzzed just as he ladled oatmeal into the last bowl. He picked up his voice-steady practiced. Walker residence. Mr. Walker. Diane's voice came warm and calm. It's official. The judge signed off this morning. Ellie and Nora are now legally yours. Graham didn't speak. For a moment, he simply stared at the kitchen window, the condensation clinging to the glass. His hand gripped the phone like it was the only thing keeping him upright. You still there? Diane asked. Yeah, he said hoarsely. Yeah, I'm here. When he hung up, he turned slowly. Ellie was watching from the doorway, eyes cautious. Nora clutched the edge of her sister's sleeve like always. Graham knelt. You're staying, he said simply. For good. Court said so. Nobody can change that now. Ellie didn't say anything, but her lip quivered. Nora blinked, confused. Then Ellie sank into Graham's arms, her face pressed against the flannel shirt he always wore. Nora followed, her small arms wrapping around his side. They stayed like that for a long time. The cabin, once a place of silence and creaking floorboards, now buzzed with life. There was still quiet, but it was the kind that came from peace, not absence. Margot stopped by later that day, carrying a small chocolate cake in a dented tin and a stack of clean linens folded into neat squares. I heard, she said with a smile. Thought we should celebrate. Ben stood behind her, his face turned toward the doorway. Margot, I'm here, sweetheart. He nodded, and then, without warning, whispered the word none of them had expected to hear. Mom. Margot froze. Graham glanced at her. Her eyes welled up instantly. She crouched beside Ben and took his hand. That's a beautiful word, she whispered. And I'd be honored to be that for you, even just a little. That night, the 5 of them sat around the table. Candles flickered in jelly jars. The cake was slightly overbaked, but nobody cared. Graham poured hot cocoa into chipped mugs. Ben listened to the sound of spoons clinking. Ellie watched the flame's reflection in her cocoa. Nora laid her head on her folded arms, eyes drifting closed before the cake was even finished. And Graham, watching them, realized this was the first time since his wife passed that the house didn't feel too big. The days that followed were full of small things that now carried weight. Ellie placed her shoes by the door without being asked. Nora began humming to herself while sweeping the front steps. Ben no longer tensed at sudden sounds. And Graham started sleeping with the door cracked open, just in case someone needed him in the night. One evening, after the dishes were done and the kids had disappeared into their own corners of comfort, Graham found himself outside, splitting wood beneath a sky turning violet. Margot came up the path, her boots crunching on gravel. You okay? She asked. I don't know, he admitted. It's like I was holding my breath for months. Now I've let it out, and I don't know what to do with all this air. She stood beside him. You keep breathing. That's all. He looked at her, eyes tired but grateful. You think I'm enough? For them. You're the man who showed up when it was hardest, she said. That's always enough. She took the axe from his hands, not to use it, just to give him a moment to rest. The following Sunday, Graham drove the kids into town for their first official family photo. Nora refused to smile at first, arms crossed tightly. Ellie tried not to cry when they asked her to remove her jacket. Ben stood tall, facing slightly away from the camera, guided by Graham's firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. The photographer, a kind woman with too many bracelets and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, didn't rush them. Families don't have to match, she said. They just have to belong. That's the picture they chose. Not the one where everyone smiled perfectly, but the one where Ellie leaned into Graham's side just a little. where Nora's eyes were curious instead of scared, where Ben's hand rested on Margot's knee, and where Graham stood, weathered, steady, with arms around all of them. That night, they hung the photo on the cabin wall, right above the fireplace. The nail was slightly crooked, but the love was straight, and that made all the difference. The first sign that something had shifted came not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet way Ben sat at the kitchen table one Saturday morning, his fingers tracing the edge of a worn paper with his name on it. It was an invitation, embossed and slightly crooked, from his small school tucked at the base of the mountain. Family reading night. Students perform poems and stories. Ben didn't say much about it at first. He simply held the paper out to Graham, his face unreadable, and waited. Graham took the slip gently and read it aloud, enunciating clearly for Ben to follow. When he looked up, Ben nodded once. "I want to try," he whispered. Graham felt something stir in his chest. The boy who once flinched at footsteps and never spoke above a murmur now wanted to stand before a crowd. And he wasn't the only one blooming. Across the room, Ellie sat sketching anatomical diagrams into the corners of her notepad, her brow furrowed in concentration. Nora practiced her enunciation in front of the mirror, pretending to host a radio show using a wooden spoon as a microphone. There was laughter now in the house. Not loud, not careless, but steady, a kind of music only healing could produce. Preparations for reading night began like preparing for a storm, careful, nervous, reverent. Ellie helped Ben memorize a short poem titled "The Way the Wind Feels." She tapped it into his palm using their homemade code. 1 tap for yes, 2 for no, 3 for unsure. Nora read the lines aloud every evening, slowly and patiently, while Ben followed along with his fingers across raised dots and printed letters. "You don't have to be perfect," she told him once, tucking his hair behind his ear. "You just have to be real." Ellie, meanwhile, received a letter she didn't show anyone for a full day. When she finally slipped it onto Graham's desk, she simply said, "You should read this when you have a quiet moment." It was from a summer program at the State University, a 2-week medical camp for students from underserved backgrounds. Full scholarship, room, board, and transportation included. The letter said Ellie had been nominated by her teacher, who cited her unshakable focus and innate compassion. Graham had to read it twice to believe it. He stared at the paper, then at the girl sitting on the floor with a stethoscope fashioned from yarn and plastic tubing around her neck. "Ellie," he said softly, "is this something you want?" She nodded without looking up. "Not because it sounds important," she said, "but because I want to know how to stop people from hurting." He couldn't speak for a moment. The weight of those words, coming from a child who had known far too much hurt herself, settled deep into his ribs. Finally, he knelt down and touched her hand. "Then we'll make it happen." On the night of the school reading event, the family walked into the multipurpose room together. Ben held onto Nora's elbow, his cane tapping softly on the waxed linoleum floor. Ellie carried his braille pages, carefully tucked into a folder she had decorated with small, precise drawings of pine trees and rivers. The room was warm and bustling, filled with parents in denim jackets and teachers rearranging folding chairs. Graham found seats in the third row. Margot arrived shortly after, a thermos of hot cocoa in one hand and a warm scarf in the other. Ben was third on the list to read. When his name was called, a hush fell over their row. Nora squeezed his shoulder. "You got this, superstar," she whispered. Ben stepped forward with Ellie beside him, her hand gently guiding his to the microphone. The lights weren't too bright, but they made his pale eyes glisten. He unfolded the paper. His voice shook slightly at first. "The way the wind feels isn't what people think. It's not loud, not sharp. It's soft at the edge. It's how I know the trees are talking." He paused, then continued. "How I know the world is still moving, even when I can't see it. It tells me I'm here, that I matter." Silence followed. A long, aching silence filled with awe. Then came the applause. Not just polite clapping, but something deeper. Parents wiped their eyes. Teachers nodded. And in the back, Graham stood up slowly and clapped with both hands pressed together like prayer. Ben turned toward the sound, smiled, and tilted his head, his way of acknowledging the moment. Ellie hugged him when they returned to their seats. Nora leaned across Graham's lap to whisper, "Told you he'd nail it." 3 days later, the school principal called. She wanted to nominate Nora for the Voice of Courage award, given annually to a student who demonstrated leadership and bravery. Her teacher had caught her giving a spontaneous speech at recess when another child was being teased for stuttering. She stood in front of 20 kids and told them, "You don't make someone quiet by laughing. You make them disappear. And that is not okay." Graham covered his mouth as the principal read the quote. "She's something special," the woman said. "You all are." On the morning of the award ceremony, Nora stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a full 30 minutes, practicing her speech. Her dress had a crooked hem, and her shoes were secondhand, but her voice was clear. "They asked if I was scared," she began, standing in front of the small auditorium later that day. "I said yes, but I learned something important. Bravery isn't being loud. It's being kind when it's hard. It's helping someone when you're hurting too." When she finished, the room erupted. Margot cried quietly. Ellie squeezed Nora's hand the entire way home. That night, Graham stood on the porch alone for a long while. The stars above Oregon glittered like tiny compass points, guiding a life he hadn't meant to lead, but now couldn't imagine leaving. He thought of the three of them sleeping in the next room, the milestones they'd passed, the invisible ones still to come. Inside, the cabin was quiet, save for the soft creak of wood and the slow hum of peace settling into old corners. A place once filled with shadows now glowed with something tender. Not perfect, but real. And in that reality, Graham saw the miracle. Not in the grand gestures, but in the first that healed. The days grew longer, stretching into a gentle Oregon summer, and with them came a rhythm no one had expected, yet everyone quietly welcomed. It began subtly, as most important things do. Margot Lane didn't arrive with fanfare or expectation. Her first visit after the custody ruling had been under the pretense of returning a book Ellie had forgotten at the library. But she didn't leave right away. She stayed for a cup of tea and ended up helping Graham replace a broken window latch in the kitchen. No one called it anything. No one labeled it. But the air inside the cabin shifted that evening. Not louder, not brighter, just steadier. She returned the following week with a basket of ripe pears and an old novel she thought Ben might enjoy. He couldn't read the text, of course, but Margot read aloud with a voice that carried warmth like a worn blanket. Ben leaned into the sound like it anchored him. Graham, watching from the hallway, realized he hadn't heard his son giggle like that since before the accident. It wasn't long before Margot became part of the rhythm itself. She came on Thursdays with soup and stories. On Sundays, she brought muffins and old hymns hummed under her breath as she folded laundry beside Nora. When the cabin's water pump groaned its final breath one June morning, she rolled up her sleeves and held the flashlight steady while Graham cursed softly under the sink. "You could let me hire a plumber," she offered, "and let some stranger rearrange my chaos," he smirked. She didn't press the matter. There was no declaration, no single moment of sudden love. Only the slow, sure presence of someone who stayed. Ellie noticed first. "When Margot's here," she whispered to Nora one evening, "it smells like apples and safety." Ben noticed too. He began saving her a seat at the table without being told. And Graham? He noticed in the quietest way possible, the way he no longer filled the silence with work, the way his coffee tasted better when Margot poured it, the way his hands didn't feel so empty when she touched his wrist to check a scratch. He wasn't a man given to easy emotion. Grief had carved deep, silent canyons in him. But Margot never asked him to speak. She just showed up, and sometimes that was louder than words. One early July afternoon, the heat settled heavy over the hills. Graham had taken the kids to the creek to cool off. Margot arrived to find the cabin empty, so she set about tidying up, not because she had to, but because it felt right. She found one of Ellie's notebooks open on the table. A sketch of a human heart labeled with near-perfect accuracy. Tucked beside it was a list titled "Things That Make Me Feel Safe." Graham's hands when he ties my shoes. Nora's laugh. Ben's listening face. The smell of cinnamon. Margot's voice when she reads. She didn't cry, but she sat down slowly and let the quiet hold her. That night, Graham grilled corn over the fire pit. The children roasted marshmallows. Margot sat on the porch swing, watching them. Graham joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "You ever think," he asked, "about what it means to stay?" She turned to him, her eyes catching the last light of the sunset. "Every day. I just never thought I'd get to do it again." He nodded. "Me neither." Their hands brushed on the swing's armrest. Neither pulled away. In the weeks that followed, Margot began leaving a toothbrush in the bathroom drawer, a cardigan on the coat hook, a jar of honey on the shelf labeled Margot's. No one questioned it. One afternoon, Nora drew a picture of their family. Stick figures, all smiling. 5 figures, one tall with gray hair and a red scarf. "Is that you?" Graham asked, pointing. Nora shook her head. "That's Margot." Graham didn't say anything. He just folded the drawing and placed it in the drawer where he kept the important things. Love, it turned out, didn't need announcement. It needed consistency. It needed a chair pulled out, a bedtime story read twice, a hand held when no one was looking. And for the first time in a long while, Graham wasn't afraid of the future. Not because it was certain, but because it would be shared. That night, after the children were asleep and the dishes were done, Margot stepped out onto the porch. Graham followed. "You don't have to keep showing up," he said, voice low. She looked out at the stars. "I know, but I want—" He nodded, then whispered something barely audible. "Thank you." She reached for his hand. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I already know." And in that moment, beneath a sky full of old light, 2 people who thought love had passed them by sat side by side, not as saviors or survivors, but as something far simpler, companions. And the cabin, once filled only with the echoes of grief, now pulsed with something stronger than memory, belonging. The wind was soft that evening, carrying the smell of damp earth and the last traces of lilac blooms from the trees that bordered the clearing. The cabin windows glowed like lanterns in the dusk, and inside, the little family was finishing their supper. Graham had made stew that night, with what he called just enough of everything. And the 5 of them had eaten it cross-legged near the fireplace, spoons clinking against mismatched bowls, laughter rising now and then like smoke. When the dishes were done and the warmth of the fire settled into the corners of the room, Margot reached into a worn canvas bag she had brought and pulled out 5 envelopes, 5 blank sheets of paper, and a small bundle of pencils bound by a faded red ribbon. "I thought we could try something," she said, laying the papers out gently on the table. "Write a letter to your future self, something you want to remember, or something you never want to forget." Ben tilted his head, listening intently. "Can it be anything?" "Anything," she said. "Truth, dreams, questions, even hope." Ellie ran her fingers along the edge of the paper, her expression serious. Nora's eyes lit up with a mix of mischief and wonder. Graham, always a little skeptical about things that felt too ceremonial, hesitated. But it was Margot who leaned over and touched his wrist, soft and steady. Sometimes we don't know how far we've come until we look back at who we were. So they began. Nora sprawled on her stomach, kicking her heels in the air as she scribbled. Ellie sat cross-legged, slow and deliberate with each letter she etched. Ben, with Graham's help, pressed his fingers to the lines on the page, letting his thoughts take shape through words Graham spoke, and he repeated. Margot wrote, too, though she said nothing of what she penned. The fire crackled beside them, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet between thoughts. Outside, the trees whispered in the breeze. Inside, a kind of reverence settled. Graham sat last, holding the pencil as if it were something fragile. He stared at the blank page for a long moment before finally beginning. Ben's letter. Dear future Ben, you still listen, even when no one is speaking. That is your gift. You know how to feel the room, how to hear the silence. That makes you strong. You once thought not seeing meant not knowing, but you know so much. Never forget that your hands tell stories and your heart hears what ears cannot. Love, Ben. Nora's letter. Dear me, don't ever be quiet when someone needs a voice. Speak up, even if your knees shake, even if your voice cracks. The world needs truth, and sometimes the smallest person has the biggest courage. You know what fear feels like? That's why you'll always recognize it in others. And that's why you'll never walk away. Love, Nora. Ellie's letter. Dear Ellie, remember, healing doesn't come from textbooks. It comes from care. From noticing the small things like how someone holds their arm when it hurts or looks away when they're ashamed. You always knew how to fix things with your hands. But your kindness, that's what truly makes you a healer. Keep learning, but never forget, love is the first medicine. With love, Ellie. Graham's letter. To the man I'll become. If you're reading this, it means you're still standing. Maybe not the same way, maybe a little bent, maybe a little tired, but standing. Remember, you didn't become a father the day you signed the papers. You became a father the day you said yes when everyone else walked away. Not just to Ellie and Nora, but to Hope. You are the keeper of their stories, the builder of their safe place. You showed up every day. That's what makes a man a father. Don't forget that. Graham. When the last letter was folded and tucked into its envelope, Margot pulled an old wooden box from a hearth. It was small, etched with fading leaves and vines. She opened it gently. This box belonged to my grandmother, she said softly. She used to call her keep-going box. For things too sacred to throw away and too precious to lose. One by one, they placed their letters inside. Ellie ran her fingers along the carved edge. Nora kissed hers before slipping it in. Ben held his envelope a little longer, tracing the seal with his thumb. They placed the box above the mantel, next to the framed photo of them all at the fall festival. The one where Graham had flour on his shirt and Margot was laughing with her whole face. That night, the cabin didn't sleep early. They stayed near the fire, talking in half whispers, like they were trying not to wake the past. Ellie asked Graham what his first memory was. Nora told a joke that made Ben giggle so hard his hot cocoa sloshed onto the floor. Margot sat close, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes soft. As the fire dimmed and sleep began to settle in, Graham stood and looked at the little box. He wasn't sure what would happen to those letters in 5 years, or 10. Maybe they'd be read aloud one day. Maybe not, but they were written. That was what mattered. They were a promise to themselves. A quiet declaration. We are here. We are growing. We remember. And that, he thought, was enough. When he turned to tuck Ben in, the boy was already asleep, fingers loosely curled, lips parted in a soft breath. Nora and Ellie lay on the couch together, Ellie's arm wrapped gently around her sister. And Margot stood at the window, watching the trees sway like lullabies. You think they'll remember this? Graham asked. Yes, she said, without turning around. Because it's not the kind of night you forget. In the distance, an owl called once. Then again, a low, steady sound like the earth exhaling. Graham walked to the window and stood beside her. What did you write? He asked. She smiled, finally looking at him. Something I forgot I needed to remember. He didn't ask more. Some words were meant only for the fire and the future. And that night, they belonged to both. The gift on the porch, a world beyond the trees. It was the kind of morning that smelled like spring and sawdust. Graham was fixing the back steps, the wood swollen from the past week's rain. His hands, weathered from years of labor, worked methodically, each nail driven in with the steadiness of a man who had rebuilt more than just porches. Inside, Ben was humming softly beside the window, his fingers tracing raised letters on a Braille storybook. Ellie was trying to boil water without letting the kettle whistle too long, afraid it might wake Nora, who had stayed up late writing a letter to her future self. Everything about the morning felt slow, the kind of quiet that only came after a storm had passed, but before life remembered to be busy again. Then came the knock. Not on the door, but something softer, gentle thud on the porch, like the weight of something being set down with care. Graham paused, squinting through the screen door. There was again. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepped over the threshold, and found a small cardboard box resting beside the welcome mat. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine, and topped with a single white envelope. There was no postage, no return address, only one line, written in looping, elegant script. For the one who remembers what healing really means. Graham turned the envelope over in his hands. The handwriting was familiar. It was the same as the letters that had come months ago, signed only with 2 words, "Keep going." He carried the box inside, setting it gently on the kitchen table. Ellie and Ben joined him, curiosity dancing in their expressions. Nora wandered in a moment later, blinking sleep from her eyes, and paused when she saw the package. "Is it from her?" she asked quietly, as though naming the sender might cause the moment to vanish. Graham nodded once. "Looks like it." With careful fingers, Ellie untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside, nestled in soft tissue, was a child-sized white lab coat, crisply folded. On top of it lay a plastic stethoscope. Not a toy, but not quite medical grade either. Just enough to feel real in a child's hands. Underneath it all was a book, Healing Hands, a young person's guide to medicine and care. Ellie reached out and touched the fabric of the coat like it might disappear. Her fingers ran along the collar, the buttons, the embroidered patch that simply read, Ellie W. A gasp escaped her lips. "It's got my name." Ben smiled from across the table, reaching out slowly until his fingers brushed the edge of the coat. "You look like a doctor already," he whispered. Nora leaned forward and picked up the card that had slipped beneath the book. She read it aloud. For the girl who already knows what many adults forget, that healing begins with care, not credentials. No one said a word for a long time. Graham swallowed the lump rising in his throat. Ellie didn't speak. She stood up, walked slowly to her room, and returned moments later with a mirror from the bathroom. She slipped the coat over her shoulders. It fit snugly, a little short in the sleeves, but perfect in spirit. She looked at herself in the mirror and nodded slowly. "This," she said softly, "feels right." The rest of the day seemed to orbit around that coat. Ellie wore it while helping Graham replace the light bulb in the shed, while organizing the books in Ben's reading nook, even while folding laundry with Nora. Every now and then, she'd glance down at herself, and a quiet certainty would bloom in her eyes. That evening, as the sun stretched gold across the clearing outside the cabin, Graham built a fire in the pit behind the house. They didn't need the heat, but it felt like the kind of day that deserved a gathering. They sat in folding chairs, bowls of lentil stew in their laps, watching the flames flicker like memories too warm to forget. Margot arrived just as the sky turned lavender. She brought cornbread wrapped in cloth and a tin of blackberry jam. No fanfare, no announcement, just her soft steps on the gravel and her familiar silhouette in the glow of the porch light. Graham met her halfway and took the basket from her hands. "You knew about the package, didn't you?" he asked, eyes squinting with suspicion laced in gratitude. Margot didn't answer right away. She looked past him toward the fire, where Ellie sat beside Ben, her stethoscope looped around her neck like a badge of purpose. "I knew someone would send it," she finally said, "because the world notices when children start to bloom." They joined the circle. The girls made room. Ben shifted slightly so Margot could sit beside him. She draped a blanket over his legs without a word. After dinner, Ellie stood up. Her hands trembled a little, but her voice was steady. "Can I say something?" Everyone turned to her. "I used to think being strong meant being quiet," she said, glancing at Nora. "But I think maybe being strong means saying it out loud. What you want, what you dream about." She held up the book. "I want to fix people, not just their cuts and bruises. I want to fix the way they feel when nobody shows up. I want to be someone who shows up." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked down, blinking fast. Graham rose slowly, walked to her side, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already are," he said. That night, as the fire dimmed and the stars stitched silver across the dark, Nora sat cross-legged with her notebook. She was writing again, this time with a different kind of ink. Not just survival, but story. Not just pain, but possibility. Ben curled beside her, his head resting against her knee. "Can I write something too?" he asked. Nora handed him the pen, guiding his hand gently. He wrote one sentence in large block letters. "She makes me hear, even when I can't." Graham stood at the window, watching the flicker of candlelight on the table, the way the coat hung over the back of Ellie's chair, the way Margot placed her empty cup in the sink like she'd done it 1,000 times before. He didn't know who had left the gift, but he knew what it meant. It meant they weren't alone. It meant that somewhere, someone was watching. Not in judgment, but in quiet, steady belief. And sometimes, Graham thought as he pulled the door shut behind him, that's all any of us need. To be seen, to be believed in, to be reminded that even in a world that forgets, some hearts still remember. The next morning, Ellie wore the coat to the library. The librarian, a soft-spoken widow named Miss Agnes, beamed when she saw her. "Well, don't you look like a whole future standing there?" she said. Ellie blushed. Ben smiled and tapped the floor twice with his cane. "Yes." Nora whispered, "Told you." And somewhere, tucked between the pine trees and the whispers of those who chose love over fear, the cabin grew warmer than ever. Because that's what belief does. It lights a fire that never goes out. The air inside the school auditorium buzzed with end-of-year excitement. The scent of waxed floors, the soft shuffling of dress shoes too big for tiny feet, and the gentle rustle of paper programs being folded and unfolded again. Outside, early June sunshine filtered through the wide windows, casting gold light across the rows of proud parents and guardians. Graham Walker sat in the second row from the front, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He had dressed up for the occasion, which in his case meant a clean, ironed flannel shirt and boots scrubbed free of the day's dirt. Next to him, Margot Lane squeezed his hand gently. They hadn't spoken much on the drive over. Words, at least today, seemed too fragile to carry what either of them felt. Beside them, Ellie sat in her neatly mended blue dress, her white medical coat folded across her knees. Ben, perched on a booster seat, tilted his head slightly toward the stage, listening to the echoes of every footstep and voice. The principal stepped to the microphone. "Welcome to our annual first grade graduation ceremony," she beamed, her voice amplified across the wooden beams. "And thank you to every parent, guardian, grandparent, neighbor, and friend who helped our children reach this milestone." Graham swallowed hard. That word, milestone, meant something different in his world. It wasn't just about grades or promotions. It was about surviving long enough to believe in tomorrow. Names were called. Children filed across the stage with cardboard hats and glittering smiles. One by one, they accepted certificates from their teachers, waving awkwardly at cameras and relatives. When Nora's name was called, the room shifted. "Next, we invite Nora Walker to share a few words," the principal said, smiling toward the edge of the curtain. There was a small pause. Then a small, determined figure stepped into the light. Nora wore a simple yellow dress. Her curls were pinned back by a clip Ellie had let her borrow. In her hands, she held a slightly wrinkled sheet of paper. Her shoes made soft taps against the wood as she walked to the microphone, and when she stood there, the room fell still. She glanced once toward the audience, locking eyes with Graham. He gave a slow nod, steady, quiet. She began. "When I was little," she said, her voice clear and small but unwavering, "someone told me that I talked too much, that my voice was too loud, that it wasn't wanted. So I stopped talking for a while. I learned to be quiet, really quiet." A few people in the crowd shifted in their seats. "I used to hide under a bed because I thought that was where voices like mine belonged." Margot exhaled softly. Graham's hands gripped his knees. "But then," Nora continued, "I met a man who didn't ask me to be quiet. He just listened. He didn't say I had to earn love. He just gave it." She looked out again. This time her eyes found her teacher. "And then I met a teacher who didn't tell me to be smaller. She said I had ideas worth sharing." From somewhere in the crowd, a woman wiped a tear. "And now," Nora said, her voice rising slightly, "I want to be someone who helps other kids know that their voices matter too. Even the loud ones. Especially the loud ones. Because sometimes the world needs to hear what we have to say." Silence. Then applause. Not polite clapping. Not obligatory clapping. But the kind that starts slow and builds into a full standing ovation. Graham stood with them, tears clouding his vision. He couldn't see the stage, but he didn't need to. He felt everything he needed in the way his heart thudded against his ribs like a second round of applause. Nora stepped off the stage, and Ellie was the first to meet her with open arms. "That was amazing," she whispered. "You sounded like someone who already changes the world." "Do you think Dad cried?" Nora asked, half grinning. "Oh, he did, Margot said, stepping up behind them with a tissue in hand. And so did I. That night, back at the cabin, Graham built a fire even though the night air was mild. There was something sacred about a fire after a day like this. The kids curled on the rug, recounting the moments from the ceremony. Ben tapped softly to indicate pride. Ellie drew little stars on the back of an envelope, still wearing her white coat like it was a second skin. Nora sat beside Graham, leaning her head against his side. "Did I talk too much today?" she asked. "Not even close," he said. "Do you think Mom would have been proud?" He looked into the flames, the shadows dancing across his worn boots. "She'd be in awe," he whispered. "Not because you spoke, but because of how you use your voice." Nora was quiet for a long moment. "I want to help kids like me someday," she said. "Like, make a place where no one has to be scared to speak." Graham nodded. "You just took the first step." Later that evening, after the others had gone to bed, Graham sat at the table with Margot, sipping tea. "She's going to change things," he said. Margot nodded. "She already is." They sat in silence for a while, the soft crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Then Graham spoke again, softly. "I think I used to believe that giving these kids a roof and food was enough. That if I just kept them safe, that was love. And now?" Margot asked. "Now I know," he said, his voice roughening, "that love is giving them a place to find their voice. To be seen, to be known." Margot reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Then you're doing it right." The wind outside rustled the pines. Inside, the air was warm with quiet joy. And the little cabin in the woods, once silent and hollow, now echoed with something soft and extraordinary. The sound of a family finding its voice, one word, one truth, one quiet courage at a time. Strength in small things, Ben's garden. The first real warmth of spring arrived quietly, slipping through the dense Oregon woods like a secret finally ready to be shared. Patches of snow still clung to the shaded parts of the forest floor, but the sun had begun its slow work of coaxing life back to the land. Birds returned to their favorite branches, and the creek behind Graham's cabin whispered a little louder, as if it too was shaking off winter's hush. Ben stood at the window that morning, his fingers lightly tracing the glass, his pale eyes sightless but focused. He tilted his head toward the sound of birdsong, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "They're back," he said softly. Graham, sipping coffee in the kitchen, looked up. "Who?" "The chickadees," Ben answered. "The ones that sing like they're laughing." Graham set down his cup, walked over, and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Ben nodded slowly. "It's time." Later that morning, Graham drove them all into town. Ellie and Nora sat in the back, chattering about wildflowers and whether tomatoes would grow better in morning light or afternoon sun. Ben sat up front, clutching a small spiral notebook Margot had given him for Christmas. At the feed store, Ben moved carefully down each aisle, tapping the shelves gently with his fingers. Graham didn't rush him. This wasn't about the seeds. It was about the choosing. It was about ownership. "Tomatoes," Ben said, stopping suddenly. "And marigolds. They smell like sunshine." The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow, but smiled. "Good combo. Tomatoes and marigolds are best friends in the soil. Keep the bugs away. A lot of people don't know that." Ben nodded. "I read it in Braille garden stories." They left with packets of seeds, a hand trowel, and a few bags of compost. As they climbed into the truck, Nora asked, "What are you going to call it?" Ben thought for a moment. "Ben's Garden of Second Tries." Ellie grinned. "That's perfect, because we all deserve another try." Back at the cabin, Graham helped Ben and the girls clear a small plot of land near the porch, just beyond the woodpile. The ground was still a little stiff, but not frozen. Graham showed Ben how to push the shovel into the soil with his foot, how to twist it gently, how to listen for the shift in the earth. Ben caught on quickly. He worked in quiet concentration, his brow furrowed, hands steady. Ellie knelt beside him, drawing a sign on a piece of old plywood with thick black marker. "Ben's Garden of Second Tries." She added a little sun in the corner and taped marigold petals around the edge. When she was done, she placed it gently into the soil using 2 twigs as stakes. Ben ran his fingers over the letters. "It feels right," he said. The planting took most of the afternoon. Each seed was tucked into the soil with care, each hole marked with a small stone. Graham watched from the porch as his children worked together without direction or complaint. There was laughter, yes, but also reverence, the kind that only comes when something fragile and full of hope is being made. At one point, Nora stood, hands on hips, dirt on her cheeks. Are we farmers now? Ben shook his head. We're gardeners. Farmers grow food. Gardeners grow peace. Even Graham had a pause at that. Where did his boy get such words? That night, after dinner, Ben sat at the kitchen table with his journal. He had written only 3 words. I planted something. Graham didn't say anything. He just squeezed his shoulder. The next week was full of small rituals. Every morning, Ben went outside with his watering can. He used his feet to count the steps, and a piece of twine stretched from the porch to the garden edge kept him on track. He touched each plant spot with his hand, whispering softly as he did, "Grow if you want to. I'll be here either way." Ellie read books about soil pH and companion planting. She began a chart to track the growth. Nora made up songs and sang them to the seeds. Margot dropped off a wind chime that sounded like tiny bells in the morning air. One evening, Graham found a note pinned to the door. Some gardens bloom in dirt. Others bloom in hearts. Yours seems to do both. M. Spring deepened. The snow vanished completely. The marigold leaves were the first to appear, small green fingers reaching from the soil. Ben knelt beside them, hands trembling as he brushed over the tiny sprouts. They made it, he whispered, even after all that cold. Graham crouched beside him. Yeah, and you helped. Ben's lips curved into a soft smile. I want to be a place where things grow. By mid-May, the tomato vines had started to stretch and lean, the yellow flowers blooming like promises. Ben began talking about building. Stakes for support. Graham showed him how to notch the wood and tie soft cloth around the stems. Ellie brought out her notebook full of diagrams. Nora painted labels on smooth stones. They all worked together, and the garden became more than a patch of dirt. It was a center, a symbol, a quiet declaration that they were here to stay. One night, around the dinner table, Nora said, "It's like the garden made us all softer." Ben nodded. Not softer, just more open. Graham looked at them. The boy who had once flinched at every touch. The girls who had arrived with more fear than words. Now they spoke with light. When the first tomato turned red, Ellie let out a squeal. It's happening. Ben reached for it. Can I pick it? You grew it, Graham said. You get the first bite. Ben held it to his nose. It smells like the sun. He took a small bite, chewed, and nodded. Still tastes like dirt. They all laughed until they cried. That night, Graham sat alone on the porch, the stars glittering overhead. The sign in the garden caught the moonlight. Ben's garden of second tries. He thought about how many second tries had brought them here. About how sometimes the smallest things, a sprouting seed, a painted rock, a boy's steady hand, meant the most. He heard the door open behind him. Ben stepped out, blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Can I sit with you? Graham nodded. They sat in silence for a long time. It's all still there even when we can't see it, Ben said finally. What is? The garden. The stars. People who love us. Even when it's dark. Graham felt the tears sting, but let them fall this time. Quietly, like rain that softens soil. He put an arm around his son. You're right, Ben. You're so right. And for the first time in a very long time, Graham let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, their roots had found home. Recognition and roots becoming something bigger. The first envelope came on a Thursday morning, slid under the cabin door like a whisper. It was heavy stock, cream-colored, with the seal of the mayor's office embossed in gold. Graham almost mistook it for junk mail, a flyer or donation request, until he saw his name written in careful, looping cursive. He opened it at the kitchen table, while Ellie stirred oatmeal on the stove and Nora practiced her speech beside Ben, who was tracing Braille along the spine of a children's atlas. Graham's fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter. By the time he reached the second paragraph, he had to take a breath. To Mr. Graham Walker and family, it read, "Thank you for showing our town what it means to rise above circumstance. for giving a home to children in need, and for raising citizens who are shaping our future with courage and compassion. He read the words aloud, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft bubbling of oatmeal and the creak of pine wood settling in the morning chill. Nora's eyes widened. They know about us? They do now, Graham said, clearing his throat. Later that afternoon, Ellie received her own letter, hand-delivered by the town librarian, Miss Arlene, who had taken a particular liking to the young girl with a mind for medicine. It was an invitation to visit the children's ward at the local hospital. The staff had read about her drawings, anatomical sketches labeled in crayon and taped proudly to the hallway walls of their cabin. "They want me to come?" Ellie asked, blinking. "Even though I'm not a real doctor." They said. Miss Arlene smiled. "They want to meet the little girl who's already healing hearts." Graham drove her to the hospital the next week. Ellie wore her white coat, the one Margot had given her, and carried a small notebook where she had drawn the human heart in 5 different angles. She didn't speak much on the ride there, just looked out the window, her fingers tracing invisible lines on her sleeve like she was already imagining the people she'd meet. Inside the hospital, Ellie stood beside real nurses and doctors and asked questions no one expected a child to know how to ask. How do you calm a child who's afraid of needles? What's the best way to clean a cut that won't stop bleeding? How do you know when a heart murmur is dangerous? The pediatrician knelt beside her and said, "You don't just want to learn medicine. You want to understand people. That's what makes a real healer." Meanwhile, Nora had started writing more. Her essays, once only scribbled on the back of old homework, were now being posted on the school bulletin board. Her latest one was titled, "When Loud Kids Change the World." Her teacher submitted it to a statewide debate scholarship panel. 2 weeks later, the call came. Graham answered the landline in the early evening, a dish towel slung over his shoulder and a sink full of dinner plates behind him. The voice on the other end was warm and enthusiastic. Nora had been nominated for the Voice of Tomorrow Scholarship, a program that supported young speakers with a passion for advocacy. It would cover a summer program and mentorship from seasoned public defenders and policy writers. When Graham told Nora, she stood frozen for a moment, then whispered, "I think this is what it feels like when someone believes in you before you believe in yourself." Ben, not to be left out, had his own triumphs. Though he still spoke little, he had started guiding visitors around their small garden, describing each plant by touch. "This one," he would say, "fingers on a tomato vine, smells like Dad's soup. This one is Ellie's favorite. She says marigolds keep the bugs away." At the community fair, he entered a sensory exhibit, The World Through Touch, and helped design a braille walking path. He didn't win first prize, but the mayor came by and shook his hand. "You taught us how to see in a new way," she said. The local paper did a story on the family. The headline read, "Mechanic's Cabin Becomes Sanctuary of Hope." The reporter, a young man with glasses too big for his face, sat on the porch with Graham that afternoon and asked, "Why did you do it? Why take in 2 more kids when you were already stretched thin?" Graham looked out at the yard, where Ellie was teaching Ben how to measure the soil with his fingers, and Nora was stringing words across the sky with her hands as she practiced another speech. "Because someone had to," he said. "Because when you've got an extra chair and an open heart, there's no such thing as too much family." Margot arrived that evening with fresh bread and a smile. She had read the article and carried with her a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a plaque, engraved in brass, that simply read, "The Walker Home Where Second Chances Grow." Graham didn't cry when he read it. Not exactly. But he stared at it long enough that Margot reached over and took his hand. That night, they hung it above the front door. The next morning, Nora stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her shirt. She looked taller, Graham thought, not in inches but in posture. Ellie packed her sketch pad and a peanut butter sandwich in her backpack. Ben pulled on his boots, upside down at first, then right. And as they piled into the old truck, Graham paused. He looked at them. These 3 kids who had once entered his life out of desperation, not design, who now filled the cabin with laughter, questions, warmth, and the kind of chaos that made a place feel alive. He turned to Margot, who was holding a thermos of coffee and wearing the scarf Ellie had sewn for her. They're going to change things, he said quietly. Margot nodded. They already are. The mayor's letter hung on the fridge. The plaque gleamed above the door. And somewhere between the garden and the dinner table, Graham realized something had shifted. They were no longer just surviving. They were becoming something bigger. Not just a family, but a legacy. The first chill of fall crept into the Oregon pines as golden leaves began to blanket the forest floor. The old cabin creaked as it always did, a kind of sleepy sigh that marked the changing seasons. Inside, it was warmer than ever, not just because of the firewood Graham had chopped last week, but because something far deeper was shifting, something neither law nor time could take away anymore. Graham stood in the middle of the living room, a thick manila envelope in his hand. It was simple. No ribbons. No seal. Just an official stamp in blue ink and a line of text that seemed too small for what it meant. Permanent guardianship granted. He had read those words at least 5 times. Still, his knees felt unsteady. The kind of unsteady that comes not from fear, but from the weight of a long wait finally lifted. Ellie and Nora weren't just safe anymore. They were home. Legally. Permanently. Unconditionally. He hadn't even noticed Margot come up beside him until her hand rested gently on his arm. "It's done," she said softly. Her voice had that calm certainty Graham always admired, like she'd been through every kind of storm and had learned how to be a lighthouse. He nodded, but didn't speak right away. Words didn't seem big enough. Instead, he opened the envelope again, just to make sure it hadn't vanished like some dream you wake from too soon. Then, from the hallway, a burst of laughter rang out. Ben, Ellie, Nora, probably arguing over who got the last biscuit or who had to feed the chickens. "They don't know yet," Graham murmured. Margot raised an eyebrow. "You haven't told them?" "Wanted to wait for the right moment." She smiled. "What if that moment is now?" They decided to make dinner special. It wasn't fancy, nothing ever was. Graham made his famous meatballs, the ones that never came out quite the same but always disappeared fast. Margot brought homemade cornbread, still warm in the cloth-covered basket. Ellie insisted on setting the table with the mismatched plates they kept for holidays. Nora folded napkins into triangle shapes, even though one of them kept flopping flat. Ben sat at the end, listening. He could sense something in the air, something bright, like when sun spills through the trees just right. When the table was full and everyone had taken their seats, Graham stood. His voice caught it first, but he cleared it gently and said, "I need to tell you all something." The room hushed. Ellie looked up from her glass of water. Nora stopped bouncing her knee. Even Ben tilted his head slightly, as if trying to listen not just with ears, but with whatever part of him had learned to feel truth. "This morning," Graham said slowly, "we got a letter from a courthouse." He pulled the document from his pocket and laid it flat on the table, right between the serving bowl and the salt shaker. "It says I'm your dad. Not just in the ways we already know. Not just in the way we eat together and laugh and argue over who left the door open." He paused. Margot reached beneath the table and gave his knee a quick, grounding squeeze. "It says it on paper. Legal. Real. No more questions. No more maybes. No more paper walls." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with emotion. Ellie blinked fast, then reached for Nora's hand. Nora, wide-eyed, looked at Graham like he'd just handed her the moon. Ben reached forward, touching the edge of the document with his fingertips. "Yours?" he asked softly. Graham nodded. "Mine. And I'm yours." It was Nora who broke first. She pushed her chair back with a scrape and threw her arms around Graham's waist. Ellie followed, quieter but no less fierce in her embrace. Ben stood slowly and stepped into the hug, resting his head against Graham's chest. Graham wrapped his arms around all 3 of them, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was breathing. Steady. Whole. That night, they celebrated with music and dancing, if you could call it that. Ellie found a battered old CD player in the closet. Nora picked the playlist, mostly golden oldies and soft folk songs. Ben clapped along with the rhythm, smiling so wide Graham felt something crack open in his chest. Margot twirled Nora around the room, both of them laughing, hair flying. Later, when the energy settled, they all gathered around the fireplace. Graham made hot cocoa with too many marshmallows. They toasted to beginnings and to never having to say goodbye again. Ellie curled up beside him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "Does this mean we can stop worrying someone will take us away?" she whispered. He looked down at her, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Yes," he said. "Forever means forever." The next morning, Ben sat at the kitchen table with a crayon in hand. He was working on something serious. Nora peeked over his shoulder. "What are you writing?" "A sign," Ben replied. She squinted. "Walker House of Always? What does that mean?" Ben smiled. "It means we're not a sometimes family. We're an always one." Nora didn't reply. She just nodded and grabbed her own crayon. Together, they made a sign and hung it on the inside of the front door. So every time someone came home, they'd see it first thing, Walker House of Always. That week, Margot stayed longer than usual. She helped Graham repair the gutter, picked apples from the tree behind the shed, and taught Ellie how to make her grandmother's molasses cookies. In the quiet spaces between chores and cinnamon-scented kitchens, something even softer bloomed. It wasn't a grand confession. No declarations. But one night, after the kids had gone to bed, Graham stood on the porch with her. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he said. "Belonging. Not just with the kids, but with you." Margot didn't say anything at first. She just reached out and took his hand. "Then don't let go," she whispered. He didn't. The world didn't stop spinning. The forest still rustled at night. The laundry still piled up. Chickens still squawked when fed late. But inside the old cabin, everything had changed. Not because of document, not because of signatures or seals, but because of choice. Daily, deliberate choice. To show up, to stay, to become a family not by blood, but by bravery. And so, as fall deepened and the leaves flared gold, the Walker cabin didn't grow quieter. It grew full of stories, of second chances, of love that finally had nothing left to prove. Forever had found its home. Summer arrived quietly that year, like a long-awaited friend who didn't want to intrude, just gently remind everyone it was okay to breathe. The snow had melted months ago, but it wasn't until that early July morning when Ellie opened the front door to find wildflowers blooming along the porch steps that the season truly began. They weren't planted, just wandered in, seeds carried by wind and chance, rooted by the simple act of staying. Inside the cabin, life unfolded with a rhythm that felt both new and timeless. The floorboards creaked not from age, but from life. Bare feet darted across the wood, chasing laughter. The table always had crumbs, always had elbows leaning in. There were books half-read on every surface, socks that never matched, and the constant sound of children growing into themselves. Ellie had taken to reading anatomy books aloud in the mornings while Ben traced each diagram with his fingertips. Her voice was steady now, confident, not like someone guessing, but like someone remembering who she always was. She had even started shadowing the town's nurse once a week, asking questions about sutures and stethoscopes, carrying her child-sized white coat like armor she'd earned through every sleepless night of caring. Nora, ever the firebrand, had joined the local library's youth council. At 7 years old, she was the youngest speaker ever invited to the town's community forum, where she gave a short speech titled, "Why Kids Deserve Chairs at the Table." Her closing line, "We're small, not silent," earned her a standing ovation and a write-up in the county paper. Graham kept a clipping of it tucked in his wallet next to his mechanic's license and the hospital bracelet from Ben's birth. Ben had his own kind of bloom. His garden, once a patch of hopeful dirt and crooked sticks, was now alive with vines and blossoms. Tomatoes hung like rubies. Marigolds flared like miniature suns. He tended it by touch, careful and slow, with Graham kneeling beside him to guide his hands or steady a wavering stake. Ben still didn't speak much, but when he smiled, it felt like the world was answering. And Margot Lane, was no longer a visitor. She never moved in, never claimed a title. She didn't need to. Her presence was stitched into the fabric of their lives like thread through flannel. She kept her place at the table, her cup beside Graham's, her laughter echoing in the hallway as she helped Nora glue glitter stars onto a cardboard protest sign about cafeteria food quality. Graham watched it all with a quiet reverence. He never said the word miracle, but it lived in the way he held the door open 5 seconds longer. In the way he sat at the porch edge every evening with a mug of weak coffee, staring out over the trees like the forest had whispered something only he could understand. One evening in mid-July, after dinner and stories and dishes washed by 4 sets of sticky hands, Ellie slipped a folded paper into Graham's palm. "Don't read it now," she said. "Later, when it's quiet." He waited until the house was sleeping. The fire was low, Margot had gone home, and even the wind outside had hushed. He opened it by the glow of the kitchen light. "Dear Dad," it read, "we call you that now. Not because someone told us to, but because it fits. You held us when no one else would. You didn't fix everything. We're still figuring things out, but you stayed. You stayed, even when it was hard. Even when we were scared. Even when you were. Thank you for choosing us every day, even before the courts did. We know you lost someone, but you gave us everything. Love, Ellie, and Nora, who said to Ed." He folded the note carefully, slid it into the drawer beside his old wrench set, and let his hand rest there a long time. Not for sadness. For stillness. For awe. The next morning, Ben asked if he could paint a new sign for the garden. What should it say? Graham asked. Ben thought for a moment, then whispered, "Home." It was the only word he said that day. It was enough. That weekend, they built a birdhouse. All of them. Margot held the nails, Graham hammered, Ellie measured, Nora painted it bright yellow with blue polka dots, and Ben traced the edges with his fingers until he knew its shape by heart. They hung it outside the kitchen window. By dusk, a pair of wrens had already moved in. Graham stood beside Margot as the sun dipped low. "Did you think it would turn out like this?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, but I hope." He looked back at the house, the crooked shutters, the peeling paint, the light pouring out like warmth. "You know," he said, "this place used to echo. And now it sings." She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. That night, they sat on the porch with glasses of sweet tea and nothing left to prove. Ellie braided Nora's hair. Ben leaned against Graham's side, listening to the world with a face full of peace. In the background, a soft wind stirred the trees. The cabin, once silent from loss, now pulsed with life. It was never about perfection. The floors still creaked. The car still leaked oil. There were still nights when the past crept in, uninvited, but it didn't stay long anymore. Because love had made a home there. Real, flawed, fierce love, the kind that grows not from ease but from choice. From the quiet promise to keep showing up. The fire inside the hearth crackled softly. Graham closed his eyes, and somewhere deep within him, something whispered, "This is forever." There's something about quiet stories that stay with you longer than the loud ones. Stories that don't end in fireworks, but in the hum of something good, steady, real, and earned. As I finished reading the story of Graham Walker and his small cabin in the Oregon woods, something stirred in me. Not just admiration, not just sentiment, but recognition. I saw my own life mirrored back at me, not in its details, but in its longing. Like Graham, I've carried the weight of silence. I lost my spouse a decade ago, and with her went the laughter that once echoed off these old walls. Our children grew up and moved across states, building lives of their own. The house I live in, modest, creaky, a little too drafty in winter, slowly became more museum than home. I had my routines, morning coffee, the crossword, the garden. But even blooming tulips can't fill an empty chair at the table. Then came my neighbor's daughter. Her name is Jamie, 7 years old, with curly hair that refuses to stay down and a gap-toothed grin that reminds me of joy before grief. Her mother works double shifts at the diner down the road. Some days, when the babysitter cancels or the bus runs late, Jamie ends up on my porch, tracing patterns in the dust with her sneakers. At first, I barely noticed. A nod, a wave, how was school? Thrown from behind my newspaper. But one day, she left a drawing on my doorstep, a sketch of my face and hers, holding hands under a crooked sun with Mr. Harold's house written across the top. I hadn't been anyone's house in years. something shifted. The story of Graham reminds me that family isn't always blood. That love can enter the room quietly, through a drawing, a question, or a steaming bowl of lentil soup, and decide to stay. Graham didn't rescue those girls because he had the means. He had nothing but a good heart and $78 in his pocket. But he chose to show up, again and again. That's the part that broke me wide open. Too often, we think we need to be perfect before we can be useful. That we need money, youth, or strength to matter. But Graham had none of those in abundance. What he had was presence. And that's what Jamie needed most from me. Not toys, not lessons, just someone steady. Someone who'd keep the porch light on. Now, when she visits, I put down the paper. We bake banana bread from a box mix and pretend it's gourmet. We plant marigolds beside the hydrangeas and call it Jamie's Garden of Wild Ideas. She asks me if I miss my wife, and I tell her yes, but not in a way that breaks me anymore. In a way that reminds me how lucky I was to be loved like that once. I find myself doing things I haven't in years. I dug out my old watercolor set. I cleared the attic not because it needed cleaning, but because I wanted to make room for something, I don't know what yet, but something alive. Maybe that's what healing looks like after 70. Not forgetting the sorrow, but letting joy live beside it. The story also taught me this. Kindness doesn't need credit. Like Margot, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is help quietly. Leave a coat on someone's porch. Fill a gas tank anonymously. Whisper to a grieving neighbor that they're not as alone as they think. I don't have a foundation, but I have hands that can carry groceries. I have ears that can listen to Jamie talk about second-grade drama, like it's international diplomacy. And I have a heart that still wants to be useful. Most of all, the story made me believe again in second chances. Not the flashy kind, but the kind that looks like a folding chair pulled up to a dinner table. Like a blind child learning to feel the world through books. Like two sisters who stop flinching when someone raises their voice. Like a man who thought his days of being a father were over, only to discover that fatherhood is less about biology and more about showing up when it counts. I've stopped waiting for big moments to justify my days. Now, I live in the small ones. I wake up and ask myself, who can I help today? Who needs to be heard? Who needs a place to sit, to cry, to laugh, to breathe? And when I don't know the answer, I leave the door open, just in case. Graham's story ends not with a headline, but with a house that sings. And I think that's the most beautiful legacy anyone can leave behind. A place that hums with safety. A porch light that doesn't go out. A letter tucked into a box that says, you mattered. You made it better. So that's what I'm building now. At 72, a life that matters not because it's loud, but because it's lit with care. A life that says to the next Jamie, the next Ellie or Nora, you are seen. You are safe. You belong. And maybe, just maybe, when I'm gone, someone will sit on this porch and feel that hum and know they're home. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.